By the early 1770s, British tea drinkers worked their way through somewhere between 4 and 5 million pounds of tea annually. Those numbers, however, were down from previous years. Increased prices and a stiff tax of 12 cents on every pound of tea imported by the East India Company were suppressing tea sales. The East India Company was Britain's greatest business venture. With an enormous inventory of unsold tea, heavy taxes owed to the British government, and competition from the Dutch who smuggled tea into the British market, prices on tea had collapsed by 1773. The East India Company was near bankruptcy. Parliament would not stand for it. On May 10, 1773, they intervened with the Tea Act, intended to help the East India Company sell off its bloated inventory fast. Once again, the financially strapped British expected the 13 colonies to pay the bill. Americans would not stand for that. Parliament's Tea Act of 1773 eliminated the 12-cent duty on each pound of tea imported into England if the tea was then exported to America, where a 3-cent tax remained on every pound of tea sold to the colonists. Additionally, the Tea Act gave the East India Company a monopoly in the American tea market, and to the ire of some would-be sellers, allowed the company to sell through favored colonial merchants. In the fall of 1773, 7 of the East India Company's ships sailed from Britain to a handful of American ports. They carried a cargo of 600,000 pounds of tea, packed into 1,700 wooden chests. In Philadelphia, the Committee for Tarring and Feathering greeted the arrival of tea with this warning to the captain of the British cargo ship: "What think you, Captain, of a halter around your neck, 10 gallons of liquid tar decanted on your pate, with the feathers of a dozen wild geese laid over that to enliven your appearance? Only think seriously of this, and fly to the place from whence you came." The captain and his ship left without trying to unload the cargo of tea. In Charleston, merchants decided that no duty would be paid for the cargo shipped there. Instead, the tea was seized and warehoused. In New York, the governor turned away a 3rd East India Company ship. 3 ships arrived in Boston: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. A 4th ship, the William, hit a storm and ran aground in Cape Cod some 60-plus miles away. Massachusetts Governor Thomas Hutchinson forbade the 3 other ships from leaving Boston Harbor until they had delivered their cargoes of tea. Hutchinson and his family were among the favored merchants granted the right to sell tea in the colonies. British Admiral Montagu issued an order to his warships stationed at Boston that the tea ships were not to sail from the harbor without unloading. Bostonians would soon devise their own plans for the tea. In the days leading up to the rebellion, several meetings were convened. Bostonians called the gatherings the Body of the People. At first they assembled in Faneuil Hall, but when the crowds grew too large, they moved to the Old South Meeting House. On December 13th, the citizens of Lexington, just 13 miles from Boston, burned the town's entire supply of tea in a bonfire. December 16th was the day before the deadline set by the British to unload the cargo of tea. That morning, a crowd of about 5,000 gathered at the Old South Meeting House to decide a final course of action. Later that evening, between 60 and 70 men and boys boarded the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. One of the rebels, George Hughes, called it the stillest night that Boston had enjoyed for many months. In order to conceal their identities against British reprisals, most of the rebels were dressed as Indians. Hundreds of Bostonians lined the wharf to watch the rebels board the ships and relieve them of their tea. No British soldiers were posted on board the merchant ships. No sailors on any of the 3 ships offered resistance as the rebels acted in an organized and non-confrontational manner. It took the party of men and boys close to 3 hours to finish their work. Altogether, the rebel band threw over 90,000 pounds of tea into the Boston harbor. The cargo was worth over 10,000 British pounds, in today's currency, the equivalent of close to 2 million pounds or nearly 2.5 million US dollars. Admiral Montague watched the 3-hour raid from his window. The Indian party of Boston made their way home. Their names remained concealed for years. On the day following what came to be known as the Boston Tea Party, John Adams wrote a letter to his friend Joseph Warren. In a flare of rhetoric, invoking Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon, Adams declared, "The die is cast. The people have passed the river and cut away the bridge. Last night, 3 cargoes of tea were emptied into the harbor. This is the grandest event which has ever yet happened since the controversy with Britain opened."